Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Right, guys, let's crack on. The front page of the Sunday Telegraph. I mean, there is one big story in town today, and it is kind of neatly encapsulated on the front of the Sunday Tel. The NHS to get an extra £384 million per week. Contentious, though, because Theresa May keeps referring to a Brexit dividend, you know.
Yeah, so this is obviously this huge cash injection for the NHS over the next few years. Theresa May has said part of it will be financed by the Brexit dividend. So that's the money that the UK pays to the EU every year, some £9 billion. The other 11 billion, however, she suggests has to come from spending, increased taxation and also increased borrowing. I would also contest the Brexit dividend idea. And as the chief economist of the IFS has already said, there will be no Brexit dividend because tax income will go lower due to Brexit and also
I mean, there are those that disagree with the IFS analysis as well.
Yeah, sure. There are those who disagree, but I would also suggest that the UK will continue to pay some figure of money to the EU for many years to come to secure the transition, to secure access to the single market. So the Brexit dividend may not be as big as Theresa May is suggesting, at least with this £9 billion.
Whether or not any part of this comes from money that would otherwise have been spent in the European Union, Theresa May has made a pretty firm commitment to spending this amount of money on the NHS.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, you know, a lot of people saw that from the Leave side of the official Vote Leave campaign with the bus and all the rest of it. And the fact is, I think there is public support to see more money put into the NHS. Of course, it's about taking back control. It's our money. We'll decide how it's spent. And in terms of, you know, future payments to the EU, we'll also be in a position to decide whether we want to give them further lump sums or not. It will depend if there's an election or who the Prime Minister is, who the government is. So this is all about taking back control. But I also think an interesting aspect of this story is, why does the NHS continually need more money? Why are waiting times becoming longer and longer? It's because if you look at the population stats, we've just seen them, 538,000, the largest annual growth for 70 years, 62% from net migration. You have to cut migration. That was another key part of the
I think the fact we're all living considerably longer has something to do with it as well.
But over 500,000 extra people a year. No wonder the NHS waiting lists are going up. That's in a year.
If you want to bring migration into the topic about public services and particular pressure on the NHS, although that's a very popular narrative that we hear often in the public discourse, it's not entirely true because, of course, we know that net migrants are net contributors to the UK economy, 7 billion a year, so they help fund the NHS by contributing into the coffers of the Treasury. Also, a lot of the staff that are working in the NHS who we need to let into the country to staff the NHS are migrants. No, it's not.
You can bring people into that while cutting numbers.
I just want to move us on. The Sunday Express has a slightly different take. They're talking about a Brexit bonus for the NHS. Right, can we just hold the bus for a second here? Hasn't Theresa May, isn't what Theresa May has done in the Express, the Sunday Telegraph, the Observer, hasn't she just made one of the biggest unfunded spending commitments that we've seen in the 21st century?
Absolutely.
Isn't that exactly what she has done? There is no detail as to where this money comes from. It's an unfunded spending commitment, which, frankly, the Tories usually have a pop at Labour for.
Well, it's amazing, isn't it? Because obviously I think Theresa May is gambling here politically. She's trying to take the wind out of Labour's sails. You see, polling shows us that 90% of adults in this country think there's a huge crisis facing the NHS, so she's politically game playing. Of course, there will be fiscal hawks who will be very, very concerned about where this money is going to come from. She's saying Philip Hammond will lay that out in his next budget. But it's astonishing, the amount of money that we're talking about after 10 years of austerity. And let's not forget that Number 10 has already been keen to point out that this is only for the NHS. The NHS is a special exception. We won't be seeing this kind of spending for other kind of public services, whether it's police or anything else.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Tories can't win a bidding war with the Socialists, with the Labour Party, because, of course, if they say we'll put 20 billion in, Labour will just say, well, we'll tax you more, we'll put 30 billion on the rest of it. That's why I think you have to refer back to, with all of these things, housing's another one. Yeah, sure, the supply side is one side of the argument, but the demand side's the other. And actually, with the government in control of borders again, as the public voted for, you can actually determine how many more people are going to need to use the NHS in years to come. And that's the point, because that's what costs money. If you're going up 500,000 people each year, that costs a lot more in terms of the amount of patients you need to service than if you bring it down to the tens of thousands, which, of course, is what the government said they were going to be doing since about 2010. and they haven't delivered on it.
Just on the issue of how this is actually funded, and Theresa May, we'll come on to our article in just a moment, but we assume that tax rises are going to come. Everyone keeps saying, you know, I would be perfectly happy to pay more money for the NHS. I mean, is there any empirical evidence that the great British public are so inclined, are so altruistic when it comes to the health service?
I think the health service has a special place in the public imagination in the UK. But ultimately, in order for the NHS to succeed, we have to address the questions around the ageing population, the demographic situation, and also by this promise that Theresa May has made, by 2023, the UK will be spending just as much money on public health as France. Now, France is a country that the UK usually looks like as having an overextended, bloated social services system. So you have to be having a very serious conversation about whether or not the UK can actually afford to do this. And I think some criticism against May's proposals were that actually by wrapping this up as a Brexit dividend, you're not having a really honest conversation about what you do to reform the NHS, given the pressures that are going to be on it in the future.
Let's just look at a little bit more depth at the rationale that Theresa May has provided for this spending increase. Page 27 of the Mail on Sunday. I mean, she has injected a touch of the personal there. The NHS, there for me when I needed it. I want to ensure it stays that way for all. But, you know, once again, we're talking about increased taxation to fund the NHS. Why is no one talking about the internal market in the health service?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very... I think over the years, we've seen people ignore aspects of what's going on in the NHS. I think we saw a story recently about there being absolutely con for drugs, con for various... They were way overpaying for bits and pieces. And again, I think some of the reports I've seen, like something else I think is massively underreported on this, is when you see nurses and doctors now, they're saying the amount of people we're having to deal with is going up exponentially. Our corridors are full, not because we're not dealing with people quick enough, not because we haven't got the money necessarily. It's because more and more people, and you're not seeing hospitals being built everywhere, you're not seeing huge injections of staff, and so that is adding a bigger burden to a finite resource, and that's where, time after time, you see these reports. That's what they're saying.
If migrants are net contributors to the economy, then what's the problem?
But this is about numbers. It's about simple numbers. We've just seen, fact, the largest annual population growth for 70 years. Now, you can talk about tax and all the rest of it. We're talking about huge influxes of people in very short time frames. I don't see new hospitals being built. I don't see new doctor surgeries being opened. All I see is a large influx, and I don't care if they're migrants or if they're here. The fact is, it's about numbers. It's about the amount of patients you're having to service, and if it's growing up exponentially with hundreds of thousands of people each year, that is ridiculous. It needs to end.
Well, I mean, obviously, again, that's a narrative we often hear. It's not entirely true.
That's fact.
If you look at what the government is trying to do right now, it's trying to get migrants in so that they can help service the NHS, as we've already pointed out. Migrants are net contributors to the economy. They help keep up public services like the NHS through their contributions. So if you want to have an honest conversation about migration and say, we want to bring the numbers down, that's absolutely fine. But on the other side, you also have to have an honest debate about what that means for taxation and public services. So you can't make this correlation which you're making, which I think is dishonest.
Of course you can.
That
you can have
public
people
services,
you need and people you don't need
public services will be massively improved if migrants are not allowed to come in.
No, you have the people you need and you don't let the people you don't need. So you get the best of both worlds. That's what we're going to do. It's going to be great.
And now, as ever, to the front pages, and one story dominating. May's £20 billion NHS gamble, says the Mail on Sunday. Why is it a gamble? We'll talk about that shortly. The Sunday Express, £600 million a week Brexit bonus for the NHS, rather more than the £350 million a week on the side of the famous bus. The Observer has the same story, May to unveil £20 billion a year boost to NHS spending, and a tragic, tragic photograph. The Charles Rennie Mackintosh designed Glasgow School of Art burned down for the second time, and this time possibly terminally. It's a really, really sad story because there is no building so beautiful in Britain as that one was. And then the Sunday Telegraph, again, NHS to get £384 million per week. There is a confusion of figures here. We're going to talk about that shortly. And finally, the Sunday Times has gone on a different story here. Very interesting, though. Less than 5% of all burglaries and robberies are solved, they say. Pretty shocking figures. And again, the May story at the bottom there. So, Nick Ferrari, let's start with this story. All over the papers, of course.
Well, happy birthday to the NHS. 70 years and all this money to be found. But hang on a second. As you rightly say, confusion reigns because the Sunday Express, £600 million a week Brexit bonus for the NHS. You could have even put the word birthday in there because, as I remind you, so that's fantastic. But no, hang on a second. You come to the front page of the Sunday Telegraph and that's £384 million a week. And to make it even more confusing, the Sunday Telegraph's own leader is still going with £384 million a week. So the figures are going everywhere. Just lastly, for the way the newspapers treat it, interesting that the Sunday Mirror, of course, very much a Labour-supporting paper, even they have to play it up. Tories pledge we're back to the £600 million a week to the NHS. They remind us of that famous bus. There's Boris with his bus, £350 million. But the line, which is quite interesting as well, the fraud. There is a sense that, of course, the NHS, as I rightly said at the top of the show, we've been asking for a while, why hasn't it got more money? But let's make sure what they get, they spend wisely.
Yeah. I say, before I did the interview with Theresa May yesterday, I went through all the different papers trying to work out these percentages and these figures, and per week and per year, and real increases and annual increases and so forth. Every single paper had not just different, but radically different figures. So it's a confusion here. We should probably stick with the percentage annual average rise, which is at least simple.
The percentage annual rise, I think just about everybody agrees, is going to be 3.4% over 5 years. That, of course, is much less than the NHS actually needed just to stand still. All of the experts, all of the financial people said it had to be 4% just to stay as we are, which are, after all, we've had 8 years of absolute famine in the NHS.
A point I'm delighted to say that I made to the Prime Minister, and we'll see that in a moment. But there is also this question, because Theresa May was quite clear, and is quite clear, that part of the money for the NHS comes from the Brexit dividend. Is there a Brexit dividend, Polly Toynbee?
Well, talk about absolute fraud. Brexit dividend, certainly not, according to the two most reliable sources, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Paul Johnson, head of that, says there is no Brexit dividend, and he quotes the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is, after all, the other official auditor, who says, on the contrary, there will be 15 billion less as a result.
Can you just unpack that? Because it's quite complicated. Because clearly we pay money into the NHS, and clearly when we, the EU and the NHS, but the EU, when we leave the EU, we don't leave the NHS, we leave the EU. When we leave the EU, so that money is no longer paid out, so it comes back. So why is there no Brexit dividend?
Partly because a lot of what comes back we have to spend again. We're leaving 40 agencies, which we will have to replicate very expensively all on our own, but mostly because growth has fallen. We were top of the league for growth until on the eve of the Brexit referendum. We have now sunk to the bottom. And what they're saying here is that every 1% of growth is worth so much more in terms of the receipts that the Treasury gets than anything that we give to Europe. So Brexit dividend, not, and we should absolutely not accept that. So says...
OK, I've got a solution, Andrew. Why don't we set up an NHS helpline so that any of your viewers are confused, you can ring them and there'll be someone who will give you... That's where some of the money could go.
Well, if you can find somebody who knows the answers, then you can put them on the other end of the phone, Nick.
But joining me now is Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who can help unpack some of these figures for us this morning. Let's go back first to the government's announcement of an average of a 3.4% increase for NHS spending. Is that enough?
Well, it's the sort of number you might expect, given the constraints that they're working under. 3.4% is a bit less than the average increase the NHS has had over its history. It's a lot more than it's got over the last 8 years. But, of course, they're in a world where the economy's not doing terribly well. They've still got a significant deficit. The debt's very big. There's going to have been a big row between the Treasury and the Department of Health. So it's the kind of it's the kind of compromise you might have expected.
We've heard the King's Fund, the Health Foundation, the Nuffield Trust, all sorts of health charities and experts tell us it needed to be at least 4%, 5% to make a meaningful difference.
Well, it depends what you mean by a meaningful difference. This will probably be enough to stop it going backwards. It's not going to be enough to make big improvements. I mean, that's the sort of pressures the NHS is facing. There are 2 million more people over the age of 65 in 2020 than in 2010. So even significant increases are needed just to keep the thing going. So we've had the 8 tightest years in the NHS's history. Following the 10 most generous years, we'll now have 4 or 5 years of just about average increases. So, you know, this isn't going to transform the NHS, but it should stop, hopefully, in a couple of years' time, yet another winter crisis.
So the Prime Minister wasn't absolutely clear on where the money would come from. She hinted there would be extra taxes. It's not clear whether borrowing would be required, but she was very clear that some of the money will come from what she called the Brexit dividend. Is there a Brexit dividend?
There isn't a Brexit dividend. So there isn't a dividend in two senses. I mean, first, over this period, if you look at the arrangement we've come to with the European Union in terms of paying our exit bill, and then you add to that the commitments the government's already made to keep funding farmers and so on, there is literally arithmetically no money. And in addition, we know, because the government's accepted this, that the public finances will be worse as a result of the Brexit vote. The OBR has said by 15 billion a year. It could be a bit more, it could be a bit less, because
I mean, it is true, though, and this is what a lot of people will be thinking. We pay a subscription fee, so to speak, to the European Union.
The point is, over this period, we're still going to be paying.
Yes, up until the end of the implementation period. But after that, we will stop paying our subs. That's got to save us millions of pounds.
Eventually we will, but actually not over this period, because the divorce bill, as it were, will continue to be paid through 2022 and 2023, which is the period over which this announcement has been made. So actually, as a pure sort of arithmetic point of view, over this period, there's no money. If you look further down the road, yes, we'll stop paying money to the European Union, but the economy has already shrunk a bit as a result of the vote. The government has accepted that actually the public finances will be 15 billion or so worse off, not better off. So there really just isn't money there from Brexit dividend. Now, that's not...
So we're talking about significant tax increases?
Well, in the short run, the government has a choice. It can borrow more or it can tax more. It could cut other spending more, but I think that's not going to happen. I mean, the scale of cuts elsewhere has been so significant. So it can borrow more or tax more. Borrowing more would break its manifesto commitment, but then, of course, every other fiscal rule for the last forever has been broken, so maybe this will be broken. In the long run, it must require higher taxes, because this is the thing about the NHS, is it's going to continue to ask for more money. If we want it to provide what we've come to expect and more, then we will have to pay for it.
Significant tax increase? I mean, people are talking about freezing the thresholds for when you start paying higher rate taxes. Would that do it, or are we actually looking at putting the headline rates of tax up?
Freezing the thresholds for higher rate taxes raises you a tiny amount relative to this. If you wanted to cover the whole 20 billion, then you would need, a couple of p, or more than a couple of p, on income tax, an increase in national insurance,
okay.
Significant rises because 20 billion is a big number.
Yeah, all right. Paul Johnson, thank you very much for that.
Good afternoon. The NHS in England is to get an extra £20 billion a year by 2023 as his 70th birthday present. Announcing the cash boost this morning, the Prime Minister says it will be funded partly by a Brexit dividend, but also hinted at possible tax rises to come.
Some people may remember seeing a figure on the side of a bus a while back of 350 million
pounds a week, yeah.
In cash. Well, I can tell you that what I'm announcing will mean that in 2023-24 there will be about £600 million a week in cash, more in cash, going into the NHS. Now, of course, we've got to fund that money. That will be through the Brexit dividend, the fact that we're no longer sending vast amounts of money every year to the EU once we leave the EU.
Well, Labour says the money is not enough and have questioned how it's going to be paid for.
We've been calling for more money, but this simply isn't enough money. I mean, NHS experts have been saying we need in the region of 4 to 5% extra a year, that we need to invest in the social care provision for the elderly. We need to invest more in health prevention budgets as well. We're not getting any extra money for social care and prevention. And actually, the government are saying they're going to pay for this by a Brexit bonanza. The truth is they're going to pay for it by more borrowing and more taxation. I just wish Theresa May had been honest about that today.
Westminster and our senior political correspondent, Beth Rigby. Morning, Beth. Or afternoon, Beth, now. Why has Theresa May done this, Beth?
Well, Kimberly, I think the answer to that's pretty clear, because we saw it on the side of that Vote Leave bus, didn't we, during the EU referendum campaign. The let's fund the NHS by taking a Brexit dividend once we leave the EU. We pay £9 billion pounds net into the EU every year, and the argument was that money comes back to the UK, we can spend it on other things, and hey-ho, let's put that money into the NHS. Now, she has made the claim today that this is some sort of Brexit dividend, but I have to say that this is far more political spin than reality in terms of where the money is actually come from. The government, just to quickly go through the numbers, has talked about an additional 20 billion a year for the NHS by 2023 to 2024. That's a 3.4% increase over the next 5 years to get to that figure. But where does the money come from? Well, it's certainly not coming from a Brexit dividend, not least because the money that we will get back, hypothetically, when we leave the EU has already been earmarked. It's been earmarked to pay for our divorce bill. It's also been earmarked by the government to pay for other projects that are currently funded by the EU, such as subsidies for UK farmers that the government have promised will continue post-Brexit. So the idea that suddenly there's a windfall that we can all spend on the NHS just simply isn't true. So then in terms of where does the money actually come from, that wasn't costed today. The Prime Minister made the spending pledge, but she didn't say how it would be funded, really. She said that that would be outlined by the Chancellor later this year. But economists and analysts would point, obviously, to the fact that this is going to be funded by either increased borrowing or increased taxation for all of us. And it's just in terms of, it's not just economists saying, it's also some of her own MPs. This is the chair of the Health Select Committee, Sarah Wollaston, a former GP herself, who's done loads of work in recent months on how to fund the NHS. She tweeted last night, "Don't even begin to swallow any rubbish that this will be some Brexit bonanza. In reality, the tax rises and borrowing will need to be higher as a result." So Theresa May spinning it as a Brexit dividend, not many people convinced. And I just say one other thing about this issue about a Brexit bonanza dividend post leaving the EU. Many economists say it's really hard, and the government actually, the government economists will say this too, it's very hard to measure what sort of money we will get back from the EU after Brexit, because we simply don't know what programmes the Prime Minister will still want to pay in, whether we'll have to pay money in to have a trade deal, or indeed what will happen to our tax receipts as a country post-Brexit. Will they go up? Will they go down? So the whole idea of a Brexit dividend is really difficult to quantify. But politically, that is what people voted for when they voted to leave the EU. They voted for some sort of money for the NHS, and she is trying to deliver that today.
OK, Beth, thank you so much.
But meanwhile, we talk in abstract terms about health. There's a very specific story about cannabis oil in the news and again in the papers.
Absolutely right, health-related. And I think, well, I was going to say any mum or dad, anybody would need a heart of stone not to have been moved by the plight of this young lad, Billy, just featured on your news bulletin there. This is 12-year-old Billy, who has severe epilepsy. I've spoken to his mum on my radio show. Sometimes this poor lad could have up to 100 fits or seizures, whichever word you prefer, a day. She managed to get some tremendous treatment of a particular drug, a cannabis oil, which was not licensed in this country. She had to go to Canada to get it. She returned to this country. She handed it to the border guards. It was then confiscated. The poor lad, within hours, was severely ill again. Credit to the government. I mean, I can't see this as any way but a successful U-turn. They have now allowed this drug, and I think it brings into sharp focus the conversation that there are these medications that could help, that we need to be grown up about.
Now, Nick, at the top of the show, I said that the Mail on Sunday front page called it an NHS gamble, and I raised the question, why was this a gamble? And in a sense, the Sun editorial page tells us why it's a gamble.
Yes, I mean, they're saying, not on your life, don't raise taxes. Well, the only way of covering this sort of money is to raise taxes. And interestingly, the opinion polls suggest people are very willing to pay taxes if they think it's going to the NHS and social care. But this is a warning to May that a lot of people on the right in her party, her Tory voters, will be saying, don't raise taxes.
OK, let's turn to a foreign story. Yes. Again, featured on the BBC News, we saw those pictures of the migrant boat. But Angela Merkel, the most powerful European figure of all, is now in deep, deep trouble. Just explain to us why.
Yes, compare and contrast. A week ago, your viewers will have seen that picture of Angela Merkel jabbing her finger like that at President Donald Trump. Very different now when she goes home. I sense the German public are jabbing their finger at her. Here it's in the Sunday Telegraph, and they've found a graph that shows the percentage of citizens comfortable interacting with migrants. A strange idea. I personally celebrate the fact that in Britain we get a very good rating. It depends on the colour it shows in that particular map of Europe. So it seems that we're at ease. Not so Angela Merkel. That open door policy, as it was known, it would be seen coming back to haunt her. It could even be now that it's the rather shambolic coalition that it took her a long time to put together could be unravelling.
She's fallen out with her key minister, who's the leader of the Christian Democrats in Bavaria, I think, and is much harder line.
Yes.
And if she now has to fire him because of what he said and done. If she does, then the coalition falls down.
You speak of Horst Seehofer, the Interior Minister, who effectively wants to put the border controls in. He's the Interior, he's like the Home Sec. He wants that's it, and we turn migrants away. Total opposite of what Angela Merkel has pursued.
And breaks lots of EU rules.
Across Europe now. It's it really, you know, we've seen Italy and we've seen Malta reject taking on, you know, desperate people picked up from the sea. This is a real crisis in Europe, I think, on migration.
We've got more Brexit votes coming up in the Commons and the Lords this coming week. Very little in the paper about them, but interesting rumbles of potential other Tory leaders, you know, waving at us from various newspapers.
Well, here's this guy who is now a hero of the soft Brexit. Philip Lee, who resigned his ministerial post in order to vote for a soft Brexit, in order to vote for Parliament to have control, and he's now hired PR, and of course they're all leaping on him, saying, he's going for the leadership, and it's quite interesting the jockeying of unknown people. I mean, Gavin Williams, virtually unknown until recently, all jockeying for who's going to take over from May.
Not all unknowns. You've got David Davis, who's talking about running up and down hills in the days when he was in the S and finding his long-lost dad. Why are they doing this, Andrew?
Well, it's a very moving story, the David Davis one, actually, because a lot of people have problems going back to the 1940s, a very, very different moral climate.
Yeah.
And if your mother was unmarried and your father walked away, you wouldn't know who your father was. Lots of people given up for informal adoptions and so forth. Now, he finally found his father, tracked him down using all his sleuthing skills, and had a few beers and lunch with him. But his father had another family he knew nothing about, and they'd never seen each other again.
Yeah. But I wonder why we're learning all this now.
Well.
And Sajid Javid, I think, saying that he was a moped victim. We're suddenly hearing all these backstories, Andrew. Why might that be, do you suppose?
Sajid Javid's getting a lot of plugs. Tim Montgomery is plugging him. It's interesting, all this jockeying going on. Everybody knows that Theresa May is wobbly, but on the other hand, her stickability has been astonishing. Yeah. She has hung in there against the odds.
She's the Praetorian Guard.
Because when it comes to it, neither side, both sides are too terrified of the other side winning. So maybe she'll stay forever.
You never know. You never know. Stranger things have happened. Not many, but some stranger things have happened. Let's talk about the Labour Live Festival. All over the papers, a slightly mean, if not sour note, I have to say, from Her Majesty's Press about this great socialist gathering.
Yes, I think that's so. Well, it would appear that if you went at the right time, there were probably more writers from the papers than there were actually people there.
Absolutely.
I think on Twitter it was a spectator garden party because all the columnists were there. One of whom was Rachel Johnson, who's in the Mail on Sunday. He needs Glasgow, where there's Jez Fest. All I would suggest is if you have children doing homework this weekend and they say, Mummy or Daddy, what does the word hubris mean? I would suggest we look at this.
Except, though, I mean, there were thousands of people there.
Yes.
But, and I was going to say, you wonder what would happen if other political parties tried to run these things.
Absolutely.
And we do know.
The idea of a Mayfest, I mean, there would have been nobody there. Even half our cabinet wouldn't have been there. Well, so it wasn't too bad.
Not all the Labour top brass turned out either.
Oh, indeed.
Well, if you're interested in meeting Fleet Street's finest, the journalists who you read on a Sunday morning, that was the place to find them, because they were all there. It was very good for you. Listen, thank you both very much. A fascinating newspaper review.
Yeah, now, the Sunday papers are full of Theresa May's NHS announcement, so let's have a look at some of the headlines. The Mail on Sunday says the Prime Minister has pledged an extra £20 billion a year by 2024 in what it calls her boldest move since the general election. The Observer says tax rises will be used to fund at least half of the extra money. The Sunday Express, however, focuses on the fact that the new money is being billed as a Brexit dividend, with money supposedly saved by leaving the EU being funnelled into the health service. Similar line is taken by the Sunday Telegraph. They say the cash injection amounts to £384 million a week, more than was promised by the Leave campaign in the referendum. The Sunday Times leads on a different story, though. It reports that fewer than 5% of the UK's robberies and burglaries are solved by police. And The Sun on Sunday says that TV presenter Ant McPartlin has found love again. Well, joining us all to discuss all of that is the former Press advisor to David Cameron, Giles Kenningham, and The Telegraph's Brexit editor, Dia Chakravarti. Hello, thanks to both of you for being with us this morning. It feels like we should start off with the NHS. We've actually got a government announcement to talk about on Sunday morning, so how lucky are we? That doesn't happen too often. £20 billion NHS gamble, according to the Mail on Sunday. Is it a gamble? Where's the money coming from? What do you think?
That's an interesting question. I think that's the question we should all be asking. If you remember, there was this the controversy. I mean, who could forget that? The figure that was on the side of the bus, the 350 million per week that we were going to get back once we'd left the EU. Whatever you thought of the figure, it was the case that we were putting in more money into the EU than we were getting back. So if we left the EU, we should have some money left, whatever that amount is, that we can spend according to our own national priorities, which seems to be the NHS. The problem here is that it's not entirely clear that it's all going to come from the Brexit dividend. Some of it is actually going to have to come from somewhere.
Is there such thing as a Brexit dividend, though? Because, yes, of course, if you look at the amount of money we send to the EU, the figure may be that we get a bit more back. But there's other... I mean, this is complicated, isn't it? Is there a Brexit dividend?
It is complicated, because I think the money that we've got earmarked to go to the EU goes up till 2023. This money is earmarked till 2024. If you take out the so-called Brexit dividend, that's $9 billion. So they've still got to find $11 billion to fund this policy. It's going to have to come from tax rises or borrowing. I saw a figure in the paper today saying that would be an extra 3p on income tax. So they're going to have to make a very powerful, compelling case for this between now and the budget. The raw politics behind this are interesting. The NHS, it's a Labour issue. The Tories can never own this issue. So they're clearly looking to neutralise a Labour issue. But this has been her first big intervention on health. My issue here is still no domestic agenda apart from the NHS. What's the big idea for the Tories? They'll be hoping this lands well. If it unravels between now and Wednesday, it's going to make things even more tricky.
Because it is interesting. This is Labour territory. I mean, I thought, speaking to John Healey earlier, he effectively said that, OK, yeah, they are promising more money than Labour are at the minute, but they don't believe the figures. I mean, that's quite an unusual position to be in, isn't it? It's normally reversed.
That's one problem. The other problem for the Tories is if they get into a bidding war with Labour, Labour is always going to promise to spend more than the Tories.
So how long will it be until Labour up their offer?
Getting into a whole arms race with Labour on public spending, which you've seen also on tuition fees, the Tories aren't going to win. And it's not a strong suit for them. They should be playing on their own territory, on their own ground.
That is interesting. I want to come back to this idea of the Brexit dividend as well. Is there a Brexit dividend, dear? Do you think there is? Because if you look at what the ABR is saying, if you look at what all of these public bodies are saying, they say that the economy and the public finances are going to be damaged by Brexit.
They're projecting that. That's what they're expecting. Nobody actually knows how the economy is going to behave. Much of that will depend on what sort of a deal we negotiate. And there, the responsibility then falls on the government. But if this government brings us out of the EU and we end up paying exactly the same amount, but with fewer rights or a right to sit at the table, what is going to be the point of that Brexit? So for the survival of this government, there has to be a Brexit dividend.
What's the point of Brexit? Let's have a look at what's the point of the House of Lords. This is the Sunday Telegraph. The House of Lords warned that they could be scrapped over Brexit blocking. We've heard this so many times at the House of Lords, that, be got rid of it. It kind of feels as though whenever they do something a politician doesn't like, that said politician says they should be abolished.
Yeah, I mean, there's a relatively compelling case to reform the House of Lords. I think it's the second largest legislative chamber in the world after China's, and it's not representative of the political makeup. I think you need an extra 700 peers to be stuffed in there to make it reflect the political makeup in the UK. If there was a window to do it, it'd probably be now, because there's been obviously this row about them being unaccountable, blocking Brexit. Look, I think it's really important to have a second chamber to hold the government to account, but there is a democratic deficit there. And at the moment, they're not coming out of this looking very good.
Are they not? Because, I mean, you're not, kind of a Brexiteer yourself, are you? Don't you think it's good that the House of Lords is providing some scrutiny that you could argue that the MPs aren't doing?
It is, but you always come down to this issue is there is a democratic deficit there. They don't have the levels of accountability, and the makeup doesn't represent, the political persuasions across the country.
Do you agree with Giles?
Frank Field has written an extremely compelling piece, I think, in today's Sunday Telegraph. And he is saying that given the sort of intervention that the House of Lords brought into this EU withdrawal bill, it looked to them, to Brexiteers, a lot less like scrutiny and a lot more like blocking Brexit altogether, just binding the government's hand. So what he's saying is he's put forward an interesting set of proposals, an elected chamber where you have industry specialists represented, but also parties and regions represented accordingly, and which would not be blocking government resolutions which are based on manifesto promises. But that's already Salisbury Convention's already there, but there is some talk of enshrining that into law. Jacob Rees-Mogg is adding his voice to it, as is Ian Duncan-Smith.
See, I find this very hard to get my head around. People like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Ian Duncan-Smith, who, you know, previously you'd think these are the people arguing in favour of the House of Lords and tradition and all those things. And now suddenly the House of Lords are voting in a way that they don't like and they've changed their tune.
Yeah, there is a credibility gap there, definitely. I mean, the other issue with all of this, I suppose, is do the public really want this to happen when Brexit's going on? I mean, that's the issue. We've got so many other bigger things going on. So whilst there is quite a compelling case for it, people may say, look, just get on with the wider issues, which is always what happens when it comes to House of Lords reform. There are other issues which always usurp it in the whole political cycle.
So but it might be quite interesting that the people who had been resisting change, if you like, in the sort of House of Lords makeup for a while, have also now turned against House. So House of Lords was never a very popular house. Well, I mean, which politicians are, I suppose, but even then. But it seems like there's now quite a wide, a wide coalition of people who've not previously worked together on this issue, who are coming together on this issue.
So it could be dangerous times ahead.
You'll need cross-party consensus to get anywhere on it.
Yeah. Or maybe they've irritated enough people from different political persuasions to unite them in being abolished. Thanks both very much for your analysis of the newspapers today.